Bottom line is these storms are being steered, period. The degree to which the climate system has been derailed by these operations is total at this point. So the bottom line is we have an industry that, in the case of the federal weather modification or weather disseminating agencies, are being gagged. And in case of the local meteorologists, they're just concerned about their paychecks and pensions. And Alex, they're literally reading scripts. The skies you see right there in that video are so typical in so many regions. And we have the local meteorologists days in advance, sometimes a week in advance, stating that a day will be mostly sunny or filtered sunshine. And that's filtered sunshine. How would that meteorologist know a week in advance that there's going to be aerosol spraying operations on those days unless they're reading a script? This is a virtual fight for life. We cannot hide from what they're dispersing in our skies. It's not only disrupting, derailing the planet's life support systems, including the ozone layer, hydrological cycle. It's contaminating virtually everything on the planet, every breath we take. But if we put a big enough break in the dam, Alex, that they can't plug, we will indeed cause a shockwave around the world as we awaken populations to what their government has been and is doing to them without their knowledge and consent. And this, again, goes back decades, Alice. We're not dealing with sanity. We're dealing with a headless, heartless, soulless cancer. These people are increasingly desperate to mask what can't be hidden for much longer. And that's what I would encourage those trying to share this most dire issue in the ridicule and resistance they get from family and friends. Know that this issue will be exposed. You can't hide this. You can't put it in the rearview mirror. It's getting bigger and more ominous in front of the windshield every day. They're becoming more bold with their weather actions because the public so far hasn't responded. Even when you have a hurricane like Helene, that again, there could be various objectives there. The Piedmont lithium mine in Piedmont in North Carolina, hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars with DOD contracts coming due for that lithium, the landowners being a roadblock for them, and now those landowners have been washed away, literally. We have governments around the globe colluding and cooperating with this issue. In fact, so much so that we know we have historical records of Soviet climate modification scientists touring the U.S. at the height of the Cold War in the 60s, and our scientists going there. So whatever the surface tensions are between these nations, they have definitely been colluding and cooperating on climate engineering operations. So the bottom line, and what's on the screen now, I want to explain that quickly. These are localized, quote, weather modification operations that are designed as a smokescreen to mask the unfathomably larger climate intervention operations. So picture whatever particulate matter is going up on that screen that's shown right now. You might have a few grams of material floating into the sky. Compare that with the KC-135 military tanker that's dumping 100 tons of toxic nanoparticles in one payload. So again, we have a power structure that's tried to mask the climate engineering operations with, quote, weather modification operations that are publicized, that are known. The single engine propeller driven aircraft, many times, Alex, with a few flares on the wings that might drop, in that case, 5 kilos of material into the sky. Again, compare that with a KC-135 that will dump 100 tons in a single payload. In fact, Alex, we've extrapolated, I'll leave with this, but we've extrapolated based on our testing. It took a NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, flying lab to altitude, which no private party will ever get access to again. That was a set of extenuating circumstances and great expense for us. But we took that to altitude with top scientists. It's all in the Dimming documentary. We sampled what heavy aircraft were emitting. We processed that at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, world-renowned lab, found what we knew we would find, starting with aluminum nanoparticles. So working with University of Minnesota, with hundreds of lab tests, we have extrapolated what the likely global dispersion of these elements is, and that's about 40 to 60 million tons annually. So is it any wonder, Alex, that every other commercial on TV is asthma this, COPD that, respiratory everything? And yes, there's pollution. We recognize that. We're not denying that. But when you have this intentional dumping of nanoparticles that are extremely inflammatory to the respiratory systems of toxic elements, aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants, there's HAARP that you're showing now. And that HAARP is an ionosphere heater. It's directional. They can bounce that signal off the atmosphere. And bring it down. And
most environmentalists today focus on climate, and climate is a real issue. And I've spent 40 years looking at that science, but what we've seen over the past couple of years is that that issue has been captured, hijacked in many ways by the World Economic Forum and particularly by Bill Gates. They aggravate the problem and then sell us the solution. And of course, the solution that they want for climate are more social controls, the big solution of geoengineering projects, which of course Bill Gates is funding all over the world. And today I want to talk about geoengineering, and particularly as it's related to climate, because it is a threat that the environmental community needs to know about, and the rest of us need to know about. It is a threat that is probably as dangerous to us as climate change itself.
The paradox, the irony here is that we have a global power structure that thinks they can counter the damage already done by human activity, anthropogenic activity, which is in a sense a form of geoengineering because we're altering the planet's life support systems, and they are trying to sell us doing even more intervention as a form of a cure, much like you described the pharmaceutical industrial complex mentality. And this is the climate engineering issue itself, what we would argue at geoengineeringwatch.org, that there can't be any legitimate discussion about climate or the state of the climate from any perspective without addressing this first and foremost. We would also argue that the state of the climate is even worse than we are being told, and climate engineering is further fueling that process, not mitigating it.
Okay, so let's start with one thing that a lot of people have heard about, and nobody really knows what to think about it, but chemtrails. Are chemtrails real? And tell us about them.
Let's start with the appropriate place to start. What we're seeing in our skies are not condensation trails in almost all cases. They are sprayed particulate trails, and we're not speculating. We have up-close film footage of military tankers and commercial, nozzles visible, turning on and off. Geoengineeringwatch.org, as a part of the film The Dimming, at great effort and expense, we acquired a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab, put top scientists in it, took samples at altitude behind heavy aircraft. We sampled what they were emitting. The sample was processed at one of the top testing institutions in the world. We found exactly what we knew we would find: climate engineering elements, starting with aluminum, which is named in one of the most significant climate engineering patents. And the climate engineers themselves have stated their goal of putting tens of millions of tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the atmosphere annually as part of solar radiation management to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy with no consideration of the consequences whatsoever.
So, okay, this is a classic conspiracy theory, right? Chemtrails. People who talk about chemtrails are regarded as tinfoil hats. So tell us, what proof do we have that chemtrails are happening, and who is doing it? Because you see, I'm on a flight path coming into LAX, and I see commercial aircraft with contrails coming out of their tails. So, and those aren't chemtrails. Where are those? I assume, are chemtrails, are they putting the aluminum particulates in commercial aircraft, or is this all military aircraft or civilian contractors? And, what kind of evidence do we have that it's going on?
Unless you're seeing a plane landing with perhaps a wing vortex, which is certainly a benign phenomenon, or a fuel dump, if you're seeing an aircraft emitting a trail at altitude, even a commercial aircraft, the chances are almost certain that that is a sprayed dispersion or a fuel additive happening in that aircraft, which is also part of climate engineering operations. Again, we have up-close film footage of these aircraft, including commercial, turning on and off at altitude. That means that cannot be a condensation trail. These are up-close images, KC-10s, KC-135, C-17 Globemasters, and commercial aircraft. We have extremely up close photographic images of the retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons of commercial aircraft aimed into the exhaust jet stream. We are not implicating commercial pilots. We are not implicating commercial personnel. They are not involved to our knowledge, but their aircraft in many cases are being used. If you remember when the big luggage situation came into play in the airlines around 2002, that suddenly it was a big concern how much luggage you carried on, how much weight there was, and so forth. And that is about the period in time when we feel the commercial industry was utilized more heavily for much lighter payloads than a military plane can carry. And certainly these are automated systems. So again, we're not implicating commercial pilots or personnel, although we are working with some that behind the scenes are leaving geoengineeringwatch.org printed materials covertly in pilot lunchrooms and so forth. But again, as far as this not being condensation, let's look at another factor. All military tankers and all commercial aircraft are fitted with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet-powered fan. 80% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. That engine by design is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. And beyond all this, I would ask people to believe what they see with their own eyes. When you see an aircraft leaving a trail clear across the horizon that suddenly shuts off and it leaves nothing on the rest of its journey, or you see grid patterns in the sky one day and nothing the next with similar atmospheric patterns, of course, something is clearly wrong. And we see loops and aircraft making large configurations in X's and so forth that we believe is to mark the air current movement. But high bypass turbofan jet engine, by design, nearly incapable of making condensation trail, nozzles visible, film footage turning on and off. And one more thing, if I could add to this, Robert, you certainly have seen all the B-17 bombers in World War II leaving the massive trails behind them, correct?
Yeah.
So we captured off the military archives film footage of one B-17 flying in formation under another, filming these massive dispersions from that aircraft. And we got film capture of that being shut off instantaneously in air. That aircraft didn't fall. The aircraft all around it continued to disperse. That aircraft continued to fly in formation. Clearly, there was some sort of beta testing going on, which would make sense because we know these programs were initially deployed immediately after World War II over the polar regions, which would make sense as well because those are the air conditioners of the planet. They knew the poles were beginning to melt, and that would be the logical place for them to start. And then by the 50s, we had Stanford acknowledging a, quote, Arctic haze that contained aluminum in the haze, and they couldn't figure out where that aluminum was coming from. So again, I could go on and on with various puzzle pieces, but we ask people to look at the data, not to believe what we say, and to consider, and I know this will hit home, close to home for you, given your family's background, which I so respect and revere. We have President Lyndon Johnson on film, on the record, when he was vice president in '62, stating that we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, 60 years ago, and quote, he who controls the weather controls the world. On film, on the record, that's the lead-in 30 seconds to every weekly Geoengineering Watch commercial-free global alert news broadcast, which is on 16 stations around the country. So maybe you've seen that, but for those listeners that haven't, I would encourage them to watch that.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
And it would seem that there would be thousands of pilots and thousands of people who would have to be aware of this program and be participating in it. How come we don't see more whistleblowers coming out, particularly people who are retired?
Excellent question. We have right now an illegal gag order on all the nation's weathermen, National Weather Service and NOAA. And that is a massive red flag. Why in the world would our government feel the need to gag the weathermen? Next, we have massive compartmentalization. We know in Vietnam, for example, did the pilot flying the aircraft spraying Agent Orange on the ground, which eventually killed many U.S. soldiers, as you know, was he told that would kill his partner on the ground? Of course not. So it's massive compartmentalization. And those that do know, we would argue, are being told they're doing something benevolent. If it's military personnel, they're certainly being told they're doing something benevolent. for the greater good. And now let's add this. We know, according to the Washington Post, as far back as 1977, the Washington Post recorded that there had been no less than 239 open-air biological tests conducted on the U.S. population by the U.S. military without their knowledge or their consent. So again, there are so many factors that connect to this. And finally, given the severity of what we face, and I would argue we don't face global warming, we face something far worse. We face what would be scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. There are so many feedback mechanisms now that have been triggered, like the methane release happening in the Arctic, and the acceleration of those events is so severe that I think it would be very naive for our population to believe that governments around the globe wouldn't engage in these operations without public knowledge or consent. And a final factor, we have a U.S. Senate document 800 pages long that outlines global cooperation between major governments, major superpowers. Even if they have, quote, otherwise adversarial relations, they will cooperate in the climate engineering operations, because you can't just climate engineer over one country without affecting the entire world. Within that document, there is a provision for total legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved.
And is it mainly, I mean, the frightening thing about this, and I know that there's been many, many tests now that are showing accumulations of aluminum, even in places in very, very remote parts of the earth, in the soils. And it's hard to explain why that would happen. And people should know this, that aluminum was never a free molecule prior to the World War II era. Aluminum, all the aluminum on Earth is bound into silicate. And so it wasn't like there are many, many other metals like iron, et cetera, that are in the seawater, and that and zinc and magnesium, et cetera, that are free and biologically available. But aluminum was really not biologically available prior to World War II, prior to and particularly the airline industry, when aluminum smelting became very, very widespread. And then, of course, the aluminum got into our cookware, it got into aluminum cans, it got into food storage, et cetera. And we now know that aluminum gets stored in the brain. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It has a high association with Alzheimer's and with many, many other brain injuries and other injuries. And so it's kind of frightening to think that somebody may be putting large amounts of bioavailable aluminum into the environment, spraying it in microscopic particulates from airplanes.
You're completely correct on every point. Thank you for bringing that point up, that aluminum does not exist naturally in the environment in free form, always bonded to other elements. And we now have lab tests from around the world, all of which contain some level of aluminum. That's what brought me into this fight. When I began to lose massive amounts of my solar power uptake, I spent my whole life trying to get out of the smoggy Southern California, moved to the Pacific Northwest, built this off-grid home. I was losing huge amounts of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting, which I knew could not be condensation, not to block 70 or 80% of my solar PV uptake on some days. And that doesn't mean there's an 80% reduction in overall light. It just means you have to have direct sunlight for solar panels to function. I began to test my precipitation, did not want to find that primary element of aluminum, but I did. I continued to test my precipitation. In the course of 18 months, the amount of aluminum in a single precipitation event went from 7 ppb, parts per billion, to 3,450 ppb in a single rain event. That's highly toxic rain. So much aluminum is falling in our region of Northern California. It has altered soil pH values from 10 to 12 times toward alkaline. Rain pH should be about 5.6 based on atmospheric carbon loading. We're seeing now 6.6, 6.8 in some cases. We're testing the individual precipitation events, the precipitation that is very high in aluminum. It's actually pushing the pH value toward neutral. And in regard to where else that might be coming from, because that's a question people ask. Maybe there's some industry across the street from me or so forth. We know from CARB, California Air Resources Board, that when they're testing from the aerosols from China, Japan, Asia, there's nothing between us and them. And CARB studies do not show aluminum migrating across the ocean. Mercury can, of course, because it converts to a gaseous state, but not aluminum. So where is that much metal coming from? And a final note, your viewers, your followers can watch the world's most recognized geoengineer, Dr. David Keith, who works for Mr. Gates, works with Mr. Gates, works for Harvard as well.
It's about the fact, an uncomfortable fact, but it is a fact, that we have the technical ability to do this. They are all fast acting, they are cheap, and they are fundamentally imperfect. They're the problems of how you control something where an individual country can have tremendous leverage over the whole planet's climate, and where there are winners and losers in ways that really could be unpredictable. And I mean, not to frighten you, but I think you can imagine scenarios that lead to war.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection.
There's all sorts of ways you could do this, but the standard idea has always been spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up.
The example many people cite was when the Mount Pinatubo volcano exploded. And all of this ash went into the air and had a cooling effect on the Earth.
And so people have long proposed since the mid-60s that you could artificially add dust to the stratosphere and cool the planet. Not that this would be a good solution for global warming, it would not. But it does show the way we're steadily developing the powers to manipulate the planet with comparative ease.
That sulfur in the lower atmosphere is masking some of the climate warming from CO2. So
is this the global dimming or something?
Yeah.
Other leading idea is basically to emulate what big volcanoes do, put material in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight.
So the problem is the following. If you add SO2 to the stratosphere, SO2 doesn't condense. So you might want to put alumina in. Alumina has a very high initial refraction. It's very small. It doesn't coagulate. And you can engineer particles that have particular properties. You can get them above the stratosphere. You can concentrate particles near the poles.
costs are so cheap that the richest people on the planet could perhaps afford to buy an ice age. It's extraordinarily cheap.
I knew it was cheap when I found that they were quoting me in tons. It's also true that particles, as they get bigger, fall out a lot faster. We sort of step back and think, okay, well, how would you actually make particles in the stratosphere? This is really engineering now.
If it was aerosols in the stratosphere, it would likely be put there by airplanes. Start with a fleet of just 2 or 3 kind of modified business jets.
The basic idea is that if you let a plume off in an aircraft by just changing some little details, you can actually get much smaller particle size distributions by doing this kind of spraying.
So there are all sorts of side effects. I'll get to them in a second. But if you put sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, for example, you could deplete stratospheric ozone.
Smaller size means more surface area, but more surface area means less ozone.
Is the stuff in the stratosphere going to be some number of people that are going to be sacrificed?
It's an obvious concern.
If a million people and we're only
bad.
doing 1% more, we're just 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
Okay.
But that's so is not the objective here. So if I made a decision, or if there was a collective decision to do a geoengineering program, and you put, say, the kind of program I think makes more sense to put about 1 million tons a year in, but let's say, you might end up many tens of thousands of people a year as a direct result of that decision.
And so the only thing that we can do to cool the planet, or that society can do to cool the planet, is deploy these sorts of technologies.